Good evening. Welcome. My name is Rudy El-Khoury. I am the Dean of the School of Architecture. Thank you for joining us tonight for one of our Tecnoglass lectures. This is an anniversary year, very special. This is our 10th Tecnoglass lecture series, and I would like to thank our sponsors for sustaining that support for 10 years, the support that allows us to maintain the high standards of the series and bring to you the best on campus. So given the special milestone, we have a special theme, which is like a best of. We are bringing back the highlights from the decade to come back and tell us, update us on their work, and so that we can see that full arc. And we actually went back to where we saw that potential and that trajectory, that promising momentum, and look forward to see tonight what Meejin Yoon has for us. And we're continuing with a tradition, a new tradition, which started this year, of having students present our guest speaker. Tonight we have Victoria Perry, who's going to have this honor. And I remind you that for the CEU credits, you can email Jessica Pace, Jessica Pace at Miami EDU. I I have no idea how Jessica managed to have her full name in her email address. I've never seen this before. Where's Jessica? Did you bribe someone? Anyway, so please, Victoria.
Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Puri, and I am a graduate student at the University of Miami School of Architecture. Welcome to the Tecnoglass lecture series. Some architects design buildings. Meejin Yoon designs moments. Moments where light shifts, space responds, and architecture invites you to experience it differently. Meejin Yoon is the Dean of Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and co-founding partner of Höweler Yoon. Her work spans public space, infrastructure, and experimental installations that explore how architecture engages people, technology, and cities. Born in Seoul, South Korea, Yoon was drawn to architecture as a way to shape cities. She earned her Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University, a place that is very dear to my heart as my sister went here, and her Master of Architecture in Urban Design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Early in her career, while working at an urban research institute, she realized that meaningful change can also begin at the scale of the individual. While teaching at MIT, she became a student again, enrolling in technology courses to expand her architectural toolkit, proving that curiosity may be an architect's most important skill. One result was her defensible dress, a wearable project that uses sensors and moving components to explore how technology could reshape the relationship between the body and public space. Her work includes the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia and White Noise, White Light, an interactive installation created for the Athens Olympic Games. Across the scales, her work redefines architecture as responsive, interactive, and alive. In recognition of her impact, she received the Leonardo da Vinci World Award of Arts in 2022. Tonight's lecture, Recent Work and Reflections, explores the evolution of her practice and how architecture can remain creative in a rapidly changing world. Please join me in welcoming educator and architect Meejin Yoon.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Um, are we all set? Great, great. Thank you. Um, there's a bit of the bio that was left out, and that was that I was a student of Rudy L. Corey's, and thus I'm extra nervous, worried how he will grade me on this lecture. So thank you so much for the invitation. I wanted to talk about agency and architecture, specifically forms of agency in architecture, and the potential to imagine new possibilities and then the capacity to enable those possibilities. I feel like this has been on many of our minds probably for the past few years. And if we survey the present, we find ourselves at a uncertain moment where everything we knew and everything we taught has shifted or is in the process of shifting. But on one hand, if you look at these images, methods, practices, pedagogies of the discipline seem little changed on their surface. Architects and planners with the bird's eye view, operating on an abstract world with abstract models, albeit with new tools and technologies, often removed at times from the realities on the ground and the realities themselves fundamentally shifting. Pre-pandemic, we were already experiencing a saturation of technologies, particularly in the public realm, where every interaction, every encounter was mediated. And we increasingly live in a interconnected age, a moment that's both characterized by a superabundance of information and connectivity, and at the same time, an unprecedented amount of uncertainty, where the age of information coincides with the age of post-truth. And in addition to these social, economic, and political questions of our time, we're experiencing devastating fires, 100-year storms occur with greater and greater frequency. We're all facing the impacts of sea level rise. So what can architecture do when the challenges feel so daunting? And as designers and stewards of the built environment, do we have agency? If so, where do we have agency to build a better world? Herbert Simon, an early pioneer of AI theory, once said, and I'm paraphrasing, science is the study of the world as it is, and design is the study of the world as it ought to be. And so I'm really interested in this oughtness, how the world ought to be. And I wanted to start with our institutions, both because of the importance of institutions, but also because institutions have probably never felt so fragile or as fragile as they do today. So the memorial to enslaved laborers I shared here many years ago as it was just finishing completion. The project endeavors to honor the 4,000 enslaved men, women, and children who built, worked, and sustained the university from its founding in 1817 to the Civil War. We could see the academical village. It's been designated a National Historic Landmark and a World Heritage Site by UNESCO for its significance culturally. And the lawn, the rotunda, the flanking cloister of pavilions, as architects, we're very familiar with in our history education because this campus was associated with the ideals of American democracy and as an archetype for the ideals of an American university. So founded by Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, third president of the United States, architect of the University of Virginia, and of course, owner of over 600 enslaved men, women, and children in his lifetime. So Mabel Wilson, our collaborator, often says that to tell the history of the United States requires reckoning with hard truths and those histories that have been silenced in the nation's archives and the public spaces. So if you look at this print, hiding in plain sight for 155 years, you see evidence of the enslaved laborers at the university who built and toiled and sustained the university in its early years. And there was a one-to-one dependency. There were roughly, an equal number of students and faculty to enslaved men, women, and children on the campus. And many young boys did backbreaking labor, digging the clay and filling the molds and firing the brick for the estimated 1.2 million bricks for the rotunda. And their fingerprints, their literal fingerprints, are pressed into the bricks like these at Monticello and have stories to tell. So the first official recognition of this history was through an expression of regret issued by UVA's Board of Visitors in 2007, and a plaque was installed. And as part of a class by a faculty member, students were asked to find this plaque, and many couldn't find it. And when students did find it, they were outraged at the scale, that it was underfoot. And so they created their own organization and called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. That's where the name of the memorial comes from. And they organized a competition amongst themselves to design a memorial to this history and in honor of those who were enslaved. The competition, stalled, or it remained in the kind of student competition sphere until about 60, 80 unmarked graves were discovered in the university cemetery. And the president of the university at the time then, Teresa Sullivan, started the President's Commission on Slavery at the university. So this was a collaborative project that had artists, historians, designers, architects, landscape architects, a faculty member who specializes in engagement. And we worked together to design several schemes. And what we did was given the topic, given the kind of challenges around the topic, we found that in all the community engagement meetings and in all the stakeholder meetings, it was almost impossible to move productively towards a memorial. We really had to spend about 6 months just listening. And one of the toolkits that we utilized for that listening was quick sketches, design ideas to gain feedback on as much of what was not in the interest of the university and the community members, and most importantly, the descendants of the enslaved, and what was. And we were surprised by how some of the ideas that we thought were the strongest and most compelling were of no interest to particularly the descendants of the enslaved. So the right scheme was one of my favorites, and it was a purely ephemeral memorial where we would plant locust plants, and they would bloom, every spring and turn the lawn purple. But what we heard from the community is they wanted a physical space, a place to do the kind of reckoning of this history, a place where the community could gather. And ultimately, it was clear that the memorial had to create that space. the idea of a kind of gathering in a circle. This is an ecstatic dance called the ring shout. And these ideas of gathering together to commune and pay respects became the driver for the design of the memorial. So it's on one hand quite simple. It's a circle that intersects a path on a tangent. The diameter of the memorial is the same as the diameter of the rotunda, but the difference is the memorial is essentially two intersecting cones, a kind of conical section that's open to the sky versus enclosed. And that simple geometry gives us a place to gather and several surfaces to honor the enslaved and try to capture in the materials the history as well as the present. So it's essentially when you enter, it's like a curb. It's very, very shallow, and the ramp slopes ever so gently down as the wall slopes ever so gently upwards. So it always creates a kind of openness and a sense that there's no way to be out of sight. But when you're within it, it creates this kind of human scale to the project. The wall reaches 8 feet high, and it essentially creates a new horizon line in that landscape. And we worked on that horizon line very carefully through these full-scale mock-ups, really focused on how to create that line in the landscape where both the solid blocks of stones and the planar stones can come seamlessly together to create that horizon line. And because there were an inner surface and an outer surface, the approach to them was quite different. The outer surface, we were really conscious of the kind of material artifacts of the time, these unmarked gravestones that were really rough because they were not honed. There wasn't the ability to hone those stones at the time. And we saw each surface as telling a part of the story of this history. And so the outer surface has this kind of rough-hewn element like the tombstones. And they're created by both the kind of striation and the kind of scooping, the scalloping of the surface. And in seeking like whose voice to lift, we settled on over time Isabella Gibbons, that her words, she's the only enslaved person that we have a photograph and a description in her own words, as well as a first and a last name. So the memorial starts with a quote from Isabella, and we worked with amazing artists, Eto Otutigbe, who did this piece called Becoming Visible. And one thing the community wanted was a literal representation. The abstractness of the memorial, they found, did not do enough work in terms of the kind of literal representation of an enslaved person. And so we took Isabella Gibbons's eyes to a kind of colossal scale, and then carved her eyes into the stone through this V-groove method that's overlaid, on the scallops, and worked hard to make that legible. And so if you're there at certain times of day when the light is just right, from a certain angle, you see Isabella Gibbons's eyes staring back at you. We also struggled with um, uh, represent the individuals. In a memorial, typically you have names, and here we know there were 4,000 enslaved people, but the records of their first and last names are in fact very, very few. So we made the decision to create 4,000 memory marks, and where we knew a name, a first or a last name, a kinship relationship, or a skill, or their craft, we added it to create this kind of genealogical cloud. And these cuts in the memorial are also crescent shaped and dig deeper. And so after it rains, the water is held in that cut just a little bit longer while the surface dries around it, and then cries or bleeds the water after a storm. And the memorial was opened during the pandemic, just after the murder of George Floyd. And we saw one person there taking a knee, and then a few more, and then a few more, and then many, many more. So, universities have long legacies, histories that often need repair. But universities, I think, also play a role in not only the American values and ideals in terms of American universities, but I think they have a role to play in fostering democratic ideals, new knowledge creation, justice, truth. And so a project that we are working on right now at the University of Virginia is the design of an Institute of Democracy. And it's really interesting, having worked, on the memorial and understanding the history and the important history of that academical village. UVA is expanding on this Emmett Ivy corridor, and there's new disciplines, and those new disciplines like data science need new buildings, and so there's a kind of encapsulation of the kind of moment of knowledge today. And the decision was made to have the buildings terminate similar to the way Rotunda terminates the academical village with the Institute of Democracy. But the difference is we wanted to create a kind of porosity to the to the building. We considered it a building with many doors. That's anchored by a place of gathering and a place of discourse and debate, which is the hall. Um, and so there's some relationship between the kind of rotunda and the Institute of Democracy, in that they both terminate an axis, but there are many differences. But in building in this context, one has to kind of balance that reference to the history with the new. And so the rotunda then becomes the kind of deep red. Here it's wood versus brick. But the organization of the building is really based on new knowledge production, deep research, and then discourse and engagement with the public and engagement in debates through these public events. And so the diagram of the building really is this simple. It's like two L's framing the place of gathering, or the auditorium. And the other thing we really wanted to make sure the auditorium had was this is an image of a space in the Kennedy School at Harvard, where it feels incredibly intimate, and you can have the perspective of anyone in the room, and then you can, hear the debates going on live, and that kind of intimacy was something we wanted to capture in this 360-degree auditorium. So we made it 360 so that it's not left, right, and that there's many layers, and you could have every vantage point within the space. And those kind of geometries, which are really pure in the rotunda, are a little modified in the auditorium. So this is both the stair and the auditorium, and also a boardroom. So things are under construction now. We call it the avocado, but the auditorium is then connected to the ground through this tail, which is a spiral stair that takes people directly up to that event space from grade. The other thing about the building we wanted to make sure is that there are multiple centers, and those centers are outside of itself, as opposed to a kind of simple axial relationship. And so even in the thinking through of the piers and the envelope, these precast piers reflect all those geometries that are external to itself. And so this is the individual elements that create the different scales between the research wing and the auditorium wing, and then coming down on the cornerstones of the building. And the last thing that I think ties it back to the memorial for enslaved laborers is that we had the opportunity to uh, uh, create a pilot project in the Design for Freedom movement, where we are going through the process and requiring the contractor to go through the process to document all the procurement of all of the materials of the project to ensure that there is no enslaved labor throughout the kind of material sourcing. I wanted to share, often we think adding something is something just additive, purely additive. But some of the recent work that we're doing really has put a deeper understanding, and that sometimes you need to add in order to preserve. And so I'm going to share a few adaptive reuse projects that are quite different. The first is this Coolidge Corner Theater in Brookline. It's a nonprofit independent movie house, and they have this beautiful old theater, um, and a desire to create an addition in order to preserve this beautiful old theater. So we were asked to do an addition that would turn the back of the theater into a new front, provide it with two new theaters that would allow it to meet code and the accessibility requirements, elevators that it needed. But it also allowed the theater to remain in operation during the construction of the addition. So it's very straightforward. Two new theaters, new integration of the circulation route. And so you can see the kind of line between the new that enabled the old to be preserved. And the theaters there's just two theaters, very different in scale. But the addition to the community was this room, which is a community meeting room that everyone in the neighborhood can book through Coolidge. And they really want to provide a resource for the Brookline community to understand the kind of creative and cultural value of films, and particularly independent filmmaking. And because this building is Art Deco, one of the requests that they made was to make sure the building was deco. And we struggled with that quite a bit. But in the end, we utilized similar material as the original theater building, and created this kind of undulating facade that, has that quality of the kind of billowing curtains, but is all done through hand-laid brick. And at night, it really kind of captures that sense of expectation. A very different approach to adding to preserve is a project we're doing in Buffalo. So this is the new Lipsey Architecture Center, and it is part of this larger complex that is called the Richardson Olmsted campus. And at the time, the language used was an insane asylum. So this was a large campus for the mentally ill, and it has its own storied history. And it's massive in scale, as you can see. And our project site was this building 12, which was the men's kitchen. And all of these structures are connected with these umbilical cords to the other building. So we have both the opportunity to preserve this building. There's so much embodied carbon in our buildings, but this building is too small to house the architecture center. And the economy of Buffalo has become one that is tied to tourism. So the desire was to create a new structure that didn't compete or try to look like the original structure, but one that would be quite iconic, different but iconic, and part of the attraction of coming to the site. So we did lots of different models, and in the end, we ended up finding resonance with a very simple scheme where we simply mirrored the geometry of the connector piece. We mirrored it again to complete the figure. We created a entry between the old and the new, organized all the support services in the center with the galleries pinwheeling around, made sure it was diminutive to the roof line of the structure, the existing structure, and then clad it in these curved pieces of glass. And these curved pieces of glass have been really interesting to work on in terms of thinking through the mullion, and could we do this as a mullion, almost mullion-less system, and we're working with a glass manufacturer in Germany to fabricate these pieces. So these are the early mock-ups that you're seeing, and it's under feet of snow, many feet of snow in Buffalo, and should be completed hopefully by the end of the year. Another kind of add to a historic site is a project recently completed for Yale. And Yale's Divinity School was really based on the academical village at UVA. And one of the opportunities here, it was our first opportunity to do a living building challenge building. And this was in collaboration with Brunner Kott and Anthropogon. And really, the kind of living building challenge expands things from just performance and sustainability to equity and beauty as part of the criteria for meeting the living building challenge. And there, the kind of axial orientation of the campus was no longer viable in its expansion. No one could find the right door. And so the decision was to make a kind of courtyard space that would essentially house another 50 students. And so this is a 50-bed dorm, but what's incredible about it is the research and the development of incredible resilience and sustainability standards. So the goal is to produce more energy than the site can consume. The whole roof is a solar panel. We worked on tweaking the geometry to maximize the kind of harvesting of solar energy. The kind of technological advancement of these panels now is these kind of roof tiles is shocking in terms of how well those products are. The building is essentially mass timber, cross-laminated timber, glue-lam structure. So it's almost all wood. And a lot of that CLT is exposed, triple glazed, and then terracotta for the skin. But there's this one detail that I wanted to focus on, which is this is the drip edge that's built into the existing historic buildings that like sheds the water off the brick. And we thought we'd use that exact same profile for the terracotta cladding. To have a kind of resonance with the existing building, as well as use that profile to create the louvers that really manage the performance of the building from a kind of solar gain perspective. So you can see here old and new, maybe the formal expression quite similar, but the performance, of course, entirely different. The other little nod to the history is like the white wash paint on the brick. And so we have this moment where you cut through the geometry of the building into the courtyard that we are utilizing that same kind of white as a cut through the building. And so I think these kind of, even at the smallest detail, one can innovate and through one detail element really impact the performance of the building. So this is a slightly older project, but in just south of Hong Kong. We worked on a structure that is a basically simple glass box, but with a mega canopy, and worked on creating a kind of louver that would maximize the light, but minimize the heat and reduce the heat. And we found that in China, we can test things in terms of construction and fabrication in ways that have been harder to do in the US. And so this is a kind of custom die cut louver, which would be very hard to do with small volume in the United States, but it creates this kind of beautiful light-filled canopy that is a shade structure to the architecture below it. The other way I think architects gain capacity is through pooling expertise and building new knowledge. And so one of the older projects, the Collier Memorial, I had opportunity to collaborate with amazing engineers. And what was interesting was that it built on the knowledge of academic doctoral theses and student projects as the foundation for the principles that would be used to guide this kind of this shallow 5 half arch vault, which is fully compressive. There's no post-tension steel in it. It uses just gravity and force to create this fully compressive structure. And what was also fascinating to me was I always thought engineers had the answer and architects, we were the ones that were always debating. But in fact, you put 5 engineers in a room and they will all disagree on what is possible, because they're also factoring in constructability, risk, and not just the pure math calculation. So that project, the Collier Memorial, really led to a kind of exploration and partnership, not only with engineers, structural engineers, but also with fabricators and masons, and really learned to respect people's craft and the kind of incredible decades, sometimes centuries knowledge that people hold. And we were able to treat the project like a research project. And so the engineers weren't actually 100% sure if it could be fully in compression without adding the grout in, but in fact, it was pretty close. And the other thing we learned is how driven the costs of any building is by the kind of time of construction. And so thinking through how the memorial would be assembled, the whole full sequence became critical. So I mentioned that because I wanted to show 2 projects, one that learned formally from the memorial, Collier Memorial, and one that learned, I would say, tectonically and from a kind of construction perspective from the memorial. So Rudolph reminded me that I showed this project, which was just a rendering. I don't know, was it 8 years ago? And similar to the Collier Memorial, that there's a kind of Boolean formal technique used to carve out the center, and that allows this kind of cross view at the ground plane level that would connects to the water and the landscape beyond. And so that kind of porosity through the carving through of the kind of ground level and elevated ground level, because it mediates a section, really drove the design of the project. And it's been under construction for several years now, and is recently almost done. But it's a boutique hotel, a wellness center with just a handful of rooms. But those rooms need a view out, and yet the formal geometry wants to create a kind of tautness to it. And so working there with a kind of creating this custom extrusion that allows the envelope or screen to snap in this manner, I think has been incredible to watch. So this is the almost completed construction photograph set. So hopefully it will be done very shortly. Sort of the opposite lesson and completely different means and methods is a housing project recently completed in Boston. And this is a map of Boston. You can see that the majority of Boston is built on land that has been created, with only what's in yellow here as the kind of original landmass of Boston. And so that one street is actually where the Stewart Street is positioned on Neelan Street. So it's right next to this very tiny neighborhood called Bay Village, which is these two-story brick houses, very beautiful kind of townhouse fabric. But there's been an empty site on it for many, many decades because the footprint is just too small to develop. And so it's remained empty. So the clients asked if we could design a building on this tiny footprint. And the things that are going to drive the costs are really construction. Uh, and the other criteria was that it couldn't feel like a cheap, thin building. They really wanted to capture the kind of depth of the kind of materials in that neighborhood context. So we did a number of studies, and the project we ended up settling on was uh, a, 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 a a building of two sheared volumes, which would take the kind of fluting of the architecture around it, but create those flutes in such a way that they could be multi-story. And so what drove the whole project was the crane and the erection sequence of these multi-story panels so that it could be built as quickly as possible. Um, and so there's several types and they're aggregated together. And we actually thought before we worked with the precast fabricator that the goal is to minimize the number of molds, but we learned that the molds are not expensive. And the thing that drives the cost is what they call the minimum number of picks, like the pick point on these panels. And so you can see some are 2 stories, some are 3 stories, and some are even 4 stories tall to complete the project. And then the other important innovation of the project, which was unknown to us at the time, was that the neighbors in the townhouses really didn't want a back to the building. So this building has no back for really loading, or they didn't want the loading on the back. So the other small innovation we made that enabled it to get the neighborhood's approval was the creation of 2 small townhouses. So it's like a tower with 2 townhouses at the ground level, and you can get into your townhouse both through the lobby or through your front door. And I wanted to close with 2 projects. One, the Moongate Bridge, which also was a competition on the Shanghai Expo site. And so this is a photograph of after the expo. I don't know if you guys recall the expo, but Heather Wick had his amazing UK pavilion at the time. That was his breakout project. But after 2010, the site sat vacant for almost a decade. And in the meantime, the city just kept expanding and growing around it. So a decision was made to actually turn this expo site that was previously on the periphery of the city, now becoming part of the center of the city, into a kind of cultural park for the public and a kind of lungs of the city, a la Central Park. And there was a competition to design 2 bridges. So one of the things we really appreciated about bridges in China is they're not the most immediate point point A to point B contact, that really the bridge as an experience becomes critical, less the destination, and really how to turn it into an experience itself. So the idea was to go from two bridges really to thinking of it as a big plaza with a hole that framed the water. So that was the concept, the rendering, and this was built also during the pandemic. And it curves in both plan and section. And then that curvature really reflects the water below it. And then on the interior, we use these kind of modular elements to create a kind of more human scale to the project. And the last project is also in the water and was recently done for the Venice Biennale and was at COP30 in Belém. And the goal was to build further discourse around climate action and sea level rise. And we designed with Carlo Ratti this floating plaza. And it's a floating plaza as if it's displaced from the city. And it uses just geometry and buoyancy in order to float and float exactly at the right level, which is just a few inches freeboard above the water. And so here you can see how it fills with water in order to sink to a certain level, and it pumps the water out in order to rise. And we created this pool in the middle to bring your attention back to the water and the transformation of the planet with the glaciers melting. And the idea was that it would be in Venice for the Biennale, but then it would go to COP30 in Belém. And this was a gift from the Italian government to the Brazilian government. And this is, and because in Belém it's becomes a permanent structure, it gets a canopy and a roof. And then became a site for conversations and talks and lectures on climate change. So I'm going to end here, which is at Cornell on the roof of the old architecture building called Rand Hall. This is 1969. And Buckminster Fuller came to Cornell. Actually, this is 1952. And Arthur Gensler is in the front on a ladder. And they constructed this geodesic dome on the roof. And just after Buckminster Fuller proposed his great logistics game, which was an anticipatory design tool that conjectured how to overcome energy scarcity and territorial politics through the redistribution of the world's resources. So his goal was to usher in a kind of new resource consciousness, which I feel like our discipline has at the moment. And I wanted to just quote him to end: to make the world 100% of humanity through spontaneous work for 100% of humanity through spontaneous cooperation and without ecological offense or the disadvantage to anyone. And I think that radical optimism, in the 60s is something that resonates very much today and has been on my mind as we think about the many ways our discipline, the way architecture can find its agency once again. Thank you.
So, remember when a long time ago, before any of these projects, I contributed to your first monograph. And I talked about the spaces of propinquity, like that this obsession you have of, designing spaces where people come together, like staging the public platform. I think it is still there. Like it's consistent. I see it in every project. Even like the last one you showed is perhaps the reification of this, where it's literally like a discrete floating.
Public space.
Yes, can you want to comment about this? Is this like a self-conscious project that you say, you talk to Eric and said, this is what we are about. This is like really an important aspect that we do, and we want to continue working on this. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's interesting, the introduction, because I feel like our early practice was almost 100% based on thinking about public space and public installations. There was also this under pressure to build buildings, right?
Right.
And that kind of tug of war. But I do think my um, interest in publics and constructing publics and creating the spaces that enable public discourse is something I can't shake.
Because even when you're doing just building, like saying just building, you find a way to put it there. Like the hotel, it's really the most like striking feature is that carved out space which creates a lobby, which is basically a figuration of the public space within that building. It's there. I can go through every project and I see how you manage to like inject that theme. Of course, all the memorials very much. I mean, it's so explicit there. But and here maybe I'm overreaching. I want your reaction on this. Was that when I was looking at this project, I thought, oh my God, even in the details of like the housing projects or all the buildings, the, when you are detailing the facade, there is a kind of a predilection for the scalloped form. It's like a concave motif, which speaks about not about defining the object, but actually shaping the space around it. Is that, is that am I over? Am I?
No, no.
No.
Okay, so I took a slide out, which is is it Aldo Van Eyck's social form slide, where there's a concave and a convex, and the difference that that geometry creates, in terms of the human body and how people can gather or be pushed away essentially by the form, right? So that's very insightful. I was also going to say, I was trained as a good urban designer by the greats, and and thus I'm always thinking of the space that's not part of the building or the community or for the public or for the city.
By the way, her thesis project at the GSD in urban design was so out there that like it broke the thesis program. They didn't know what to do with it. It was really.
It was traumatic.
It was controversial. Let's put it this way. So the also going back to the early work and comparing it to the later buildings, that in those early works that there was also a preoccupation with, and you mentioned it in your opening remarks about the technological mediation of public space and how it's always there and actually shapes the way we interact with other people. But that technological element seems to have disappeared, or maybe it has matured and has become more invisible or has been integrated more into the building. Can you comment about that?
I was thinking about that because I feel like early on technology meant like a literal blinking light or a sensor or some mechanics related to interaction. And I feel like we still explore a lot of technology and new technologies, but they are more embedded. And I was going to say, like, technology itself has changed, right? And so it is more uh, maybe insidiously embedded in processes and production in ways that are not so
But
literal.
there's a fingerprint of technology, but it's not like you said, literal.
Yeah, I think even with the memorial to enslaved laborers, there's a way some technology exploration is happening in a project when it suits the project as opposed to applied or just for its own sake.
Another aspect which has become, I think, more invisible is that in all of these buildings, you saw there is a very advanced environmental agenda. You know, the buildings are designed to perform, very at a high level in terms of their environmental impacts. But you barely mentioned this. Like you only mentioned it with regard to the Yale project because it's such an important part of the form of the roof also. Do you want to comment? Is it because now you take it for granted that of course every building, just like the buildings stand up, they also have to be performing at an optimal level in terms of their environmental footprint? Is that want to comment about that?
I mean, I think that, I was discussing with someone earlier that, right now there's a kind of ethics of building that is, that many architects are struggling with, or the discipline of architecture is struggling with, where, an argument has been made that the most ethical thing you can do as an architect is to not build. And yet there's still a lot of things that need to be built, right? We have a housing crisis, affordable housing, institutions, etc. So I do think there is a kind of case by case, like decision making around, um, like how to build in a way that is long lasting. So it creates a 100-year building instead of a 5-year building or a 10-year building. Um, it also, I think we're always thinking of like performance and building envelope. I think that comes really from Eric's perspective, but I still am not sure. Like Yale is incredibly sustainable and resilient, um, but there's also a cost to that, right? And preserving a building might also be, adaptive reuse of a building might be more sustainable than building an ultra high performance or full mass timber
Right.
project.
I had loved this quote. I just read it. The most sustainable building or the greenest building is an existing building.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So questions, please.
Last building. Every time I try to do that, they say, so it's a tricky way to get one done. But in an environment like that, that cold snow weather,
Yep.
and the fact that your glazing comes down to the ground, what happens? I mean, I'm in Baltimore where you almost walk through snow higher than your head.
Yep.
How did they treat that technically, the glass?
Yeah. So first, we're working with Front, who are incredible envelope engineers, and they've been working with us on the details so that we can, capture that kind of top to bottom single expression without a cap on both ends. There's radiant, heat that is part of the system as well. Um, and time will tell. It's
Economically operating costs a lot of money. By the way, just one comment. Showed a Mark Bensler with Buffett's book. Buffett's built that out of wood.
It's great.
Hi, my name is Lily Wong. I'm a faculty here. Thank you so much for your lecture. It's really wonderful to see this collection of projects. And something that jumps out to me is the craft of these buildings. So I have a question about that. So in one part of the lecture, you mentioned that um, there are various components that have to be fabricated not in the United States because it would be too difficult to be made here. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on how the difficulty or the coordination of the fabrication process impact how you and your client or your general contractor design some of these really innovative details.
It's interesting, like one aspect of meeting the kind of living building challenge goals for Yale was we tried to source all the materials within, a couple hours radius for that project. And then in Buffalo, the design ambition of the client was such that we strove so hard to try to, because, America has a kind of incredible history of cast glass innovation in the building industry and the like, but no longer, right? So for the glass, we had to look at companies in Canada and Germany. So I think we have learned that in a globalized world, pre-pandemic, right? It was not really a question that you would source based on the expertise of that place, and the materials would come together. And I think now, post-pandemic, and then the supply chain challenges, there's a real interest to try to resuscitate the kind of building arts and building craft and building technology more locally too. Um, and the strange thing is, we find that we learn so much by working with fabricators abroad, like in China and Germany. And sometimes, as architects, we're like, we bring that knowledge to the project and to the GC. And sometimes we find a local person who's willing to try, or a local company who's willing to try because they've seen that it's been done elsewhere.
Hi, Professor Yoon. Thanks so much for coming. I really enjoyed your presentation. Two quick questions. You showed a slide where there was a building where the entire roof seemed to be solar panel. I'm very passionate about the environment. I was just curious how reliable is it in providing the energy needs, or do you still typically need a backup generator to provide the electricity? And the second is you touched on affordable housing. I was just curious, what are your general opinion on the design of today of of affordable housing buildings? Because sometimes I read that the public tends to like not be supportive of these projects because they tend to be not aesthetically nice. What are your thoughts? And that's it. Thank you.
I'll answer the last question first on affordable housing. So Boston has a certain percentage for all housing has to be a certain percentage affordable units. So, I think that's currently 15 to 17%, and the current mayor wants to get that to 20%. And I think as a policy, that's brilliant because it means that, and as a policy, if it were required that it be in the unit, that would be even better, I think, for the community. So you can't tell which unit is an affordable housing unit. It's in the same building that needs to be market rate and attract home buyers who care about quality, right? So I think that's been really interesting. And then we've also worked on some 100% affordable housing projects. And I feel like there is a it is much harder to meet the budget constraints of a 100% affordable housing project than a market, obviously. But I think we've learned that there's, again, knowledge transfer and things we've learned from other housing projects that help bring that quality of light, air, materials to every project. Your first question, repeat it. No, remind me what the first question was. Oh, I see, I see, I see. Yeah, it's a new product. We've never used that kind of solar panel roof tile before, but it is incredible from a technology point of view. And that project, when it's fully complete, will be energy net positive. So, and it's partly because it's a two-story building. It's 50 units of housing. If it were a different scale, the roof would not be enough there.
I have another question. If so,
I was just gonna say, that building is not, got a lot of cover.
right. So I'm going to ask you the question from a dean to the. So how is your experience in professional practice? How does it have any influence on your vision for the school as a dean?
So interesting. Like, as a former student and as a faculty member, I think that the design studio is such a precious pedagogical format where it's important to keep most of reality at bay at times for that kind of full exploration. Yet at the same time, as students graduate, you realize that one of the abilities to have agency as an architect is expertise. So if you graduate and you don't have an expertise that's needed by others in the world, you're really handicapped by that. And so I do think like building technology, especially environmental systems and these kinds of uh, important courses in intersection with the kind of creative exploration of design studio. It's like a powerful combination, but somehow we tend not to do that. We think of them kind of separately, or if it's an integrated building studio, sometimes people roll their eyes at the integrated building, but I think that's the most exciting. And maybe I wasn't there 20 years ago or 15 years ago.
And I mentioned to you earlier how I feel like as a school, we are more and more invested in the challenges of affordable housing. So what about those other aspects, of the real world, being, especially when you are working on housing, making sure that buildings or designs by students have traction in the real world because they address those realities. That's something.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an architect, you're creative within constraints. And I think like finding ways to innovate at the small scale to the big scale are really important to have any agency or impact in the built environment that moves things in a different direction, right? You know, we won't need architects if creativity is not important at some point, which I don't think is going to happen. So it's not pure, like, it needs to pencil out. But if you're a designer and you can't articulate the value proposition of doing X versus Y, then I don't think you can help move things forward, whether it's on affordability or sustainability or public space or urbanism.
We have a quick question on over Zoom. So the floating plaza doesn't appear to belong in the intended environment unless the water is still and there is no wind. Could you elaborate?
The floating plaza should feel, I think, out of place everywhere. You know, it's like a displaced piece of the city that it's by nature uncanny and it needs to be kind of uncanny. And in that way, it's more about building discourse than it is about solving a problem. It builds awareness. When you're on it, it's precarious because there's no flat surface. Because in order to create that buoyancy, and equilibrium, all the surfaces have to be sloped, right? So you're constantly like your body's trying to find balance on an inclined surface. And the structure is so massive in its scale that the wind does not impact it. Yeah. Maybe like hurricane scale winds would, though, especially here.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rudolph.